The morning Callum Reed walked into the lobby of the Grand Ashford Hotel with nothing but a duffel bag and a bruised sense of direction. He had no idea that a single question from a stranger would rearrange every quiet corner of his life. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't even looking for conversation. He was looking for a cup of decent coffee and maybe a corner where the world would leave him alone for 5 minutes. But the universe, as it so often does, had already written a different script, one that began not with a grand entrance or a sweeping declaration, but with a woman in a red shirt, eyes wide with panic, grabbing his arm like he was the last solid thing in a room full of water. She looked at him the way people look at a fire exit when the smoke starts curling under the door, desperate, calculated, hopeful against all reasonable odds. And before Callum could even set down his bag or form a single coherent thought, she leaned close enough that he could smell jasmine perfume and something faintly like fear. And she whispered the words that would change everything. "Would you pretend to be my husband?" Callum didn't say yes immediately. He didn't say no either. What he said, and he would spend months wondering what possessed him, was this: "Do I get to kiss my wife?" If you believe in second chances, unexpected love, and the kind of kindness that shows up right when you need it most, hit that like button. Drop a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to FableBox so you never miss a story that matters. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, your corner of this beautiful earth in the comments. We read every single one. Callum Reed had grown up in a small town in northern Vermont where the winters were long and the silences were longer. He was the kind of man who fixed things, not just physical things like broken porch steps and leaky pipes, but emotional things too. Stray dogs found him. Lost children at grocery stores gravitated toward his steady voice. His mother used to say he was born with his hands already open, ready to catch whatever the world dropped. His father used to say he was a fool for it. The truth, as it usually does, lived somewhere between the two. He was 34 years old when he arrived at the Grand Ashford, and he was arriving the way most people arrive at luxury hotels they cannot quite afford, with purpose disguised as confidence. He was in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, for a job interview that would determine whether the next chapter of his life looked like progress or like the same slow unraveling that the last 3 years had been. He had left Vermont after a business partnership dissolved badly. After the woodworking studio he had built with his own hands and his own savings had been signed away in a legal settlement that left him technically solvent but emotionally hollowed out. He had driven 14 hours south with a playlist of old country songs and the stubborn conviction that somewhere past the state line, things would be different. The Grand Ashford was not where a man like Callum would normally stay. It was marble and chandelier, gold-trimmed and hushed, the kind of place where bellmen wore white gloves and the flower arrangements cost more than his monthly grocery budget. But his friend Marcus had used his employee discount to book it as a gift, and Callum had arrived feeling both grateful and slightly ridiculous, his duffel bag looking very much out of place against the gleaming backdrop of other people's luggage carts. He had just walked through the revolving door, just felt the cool breath of expensive air conditioning on his face. When the woman in red found him, her name, he would learn a few breathless minutes later, was Naomi Voss. She was 31, though she looked younger in her panic, wide green eyes, blonde hair pulled up in a messy bun that was trying very hard to look intentional, wearing a red silk shirt that was buttoned one too many buttons down from where it should have been, the result of dressing in a hurry. She was clutching a phone in one hand and a key card in the other, and she was scanning the lobby with the expression of someone who had just knocked over a very expensive vase and needed someone else to share the blame. When her eyes landed on Callum, something shifted in her face. Not recognition, they had never met. It was more like calculation colliding with desperation and producing improbably relief. She crossed the lobby in 7 long strides and took his arm, and the warmth of her grip was so real, so unexpectedly human, that Callum stopped moving entirely. She explained it in fragments, fast and low, glancing over his shoulder as she spoke. Her family was here. Her mother, her aunt, her grandmother, and her older brother Theo all gathered at the Grand Ashford for her grandmother's 80th birthday weekend. Naomi had told them 8 months ago in a moment of weakness and wishful thinking that she was married. She had invented a husband named Daniel, a kind, successful, quietly wonderful man to stop the questions, to halt the parade of setups and concern, and her mother's particular brand of loving suffocation that had been suffocating her since she moved to the city alone 3 years ago. She had maintained the fiction through phone calls and text messages and strategic vagueness. And now, faced with an entire weekend under the same roof as people who loved her and wanted desperately to meet this Daniel, she had arrived at the Grand Ashford 40 minutes ago and stood in the bathroom mirror and understood, with horrible clarity, that the lie had grown legs and was walking toward her at speed. The original plan had been to bring a friend, a man named Garrett from her office, who had agreed 3 weeks ago and then, 2 days before the trip, had broken his collarbone playing recreational volleyball. Naomi had spent those 2 days in a state of controlled internal spiral, telling herself she would come clean, tell the truth, absorb her mother's disappointed silence and her brother's knowing smirk. And then, this morning, she had gotten into the car, driven to Charleston, walked into the Grand Ashford, and found she simply could not do it. The words would not come. The truth felt like a hand grenade in a room full of people she loved. So when she saw Callum, broad-shouldered, calm-faced, with the kind of steady presence that made a person feel instinctively that he would not drop things, she did the wild, irrational, retrospectively insane thing that panic sometimes makes possible. She asked a stranger to pretend to be her husband, and Callum, who had driven 14 hours south looking for something different, who had a job interview the following morning but nothing planned for the rest of today, who had not felt genuinely needed in a very long time. Callum said what he said, and Naomi stared at him. And for one electric, ridiculous second, they were just 2 people in a grand lobby, standing at the edge of something neither of them could name. Naomi recovered first. She told him she understood if the answer was no. She told him she knew it was insane. She said she didn't normally do things like this, which was true, and she said she was a good person in a difficult situation, which was also true. She said she would explain everything, and that she only needed him for the weekend, and that she would make it worth his while. And Callum stopped her there and said he didn't want payment. He said that quietly and without judgment, and something in Naomi's expression cracked open just slightly, the way ice does when the temperature shifts. Not breaking, just changing. He asked her one question. He asked if anyone in her family was likely to be hurt by whatever happened this weekend, not deceived in a way that caused them harm, but genuinely hurt. And Naomi thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. She said no. She said her family just wanted to see her happy. She said the only person getting hurt in this scenario was probably herself, and she'd made peace with that. Callum picked up his duffel bag. He told her his name. He told her he was from Vermont, that he built furniture for a living, or had until recently, and that he had a job interview the next morning but was otherwise free. He told her that if she wanted to do this, they needed at least 20 minutes alone before she took him anywhere near her family, because he needed to know enough to be convincing. And then he said very calmly that she should probably button her shirt one more button up before they went anywhere together. Naomi looked down, turned a shade of red that nearly matched her shirt and laughed. A short, startled laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. It was the laugh of someone who had forgotten, in the machinery of crisis, that laughter was still an option. They sat in a quiet corner of the hotel cafe for 23 minutes. Callum ordered black coffee. Naomi ordered a green tea she didn't drink, and she talked. and he listened the way only certain people can listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, not constructing his response while she was still mid-sentence, but actually hearing her. She told him about her family, her mother Rosalind, who was warm and generous, and who expressed love almost exclusively through worry. Her grandmother Edie, who was turning 80 and who was sharper than anyone in the family gave her credit for, and who had been asking about Daniel with a particular gleam that suggested she already sensed something was not adding up. Her brother Theo, who was older by 4 years and who loved her fiercely and would be the hardest to fool. Her aunt Patricia, who was Rosalind's sister, and who had never quite forgiven Naomi for not inviting her to a wedding that had never happened. Callum listened to all of it and took mental notes the way he used to take notes on woodworking plans, carefully, looking for where the joints needed to hold. He asked the questions that mattered. How long had they supposedly been married? What did Daniel do for work? Where did they live? How did they meet? Naomi had answers for all of these. The infrastructure of 8 months of maintenance lying. Daniel was a structural engineer. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the South End. They had met at a friend's dinner party and dated for a year before he proposed. There was a ring, a simple gold band Naomi had purchased specifically for this weekend, and she slid it onto her finger at the table, and both of them looked at it for a moment in silence. Callum said he would need a different name. Naomi had invented Daniel, but Callum was unmistakably not a Daniel, and he suggested they say his middle name was Daniel, that everyone called him by his first name, Callum, and that the family had just always heard the more formal version. It was a small adjustment, but a smart one, the kind of practical thinking that made Naomi look at him differently than she had in the lobby. He wasn't just agreeing to this, he was investing in it. He was problem-solving. She asked him why he was doing this. It was the natural question, and she had been holding it back since the lobby. Callum wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and considered for a moment, and then he told her the truth, which she had not entirely expected. He said that 3 years ago he had been going through something hard, and a stranger had done something kind for him, had stopped on the side of a highway in a Vermont blizzard and helped him change a tire, and refused any thanks. And he had never quite found the right person to pay it forward to. He wasn't sure Naomi's situation was exactly what the universe had in mind, but then again, he wasn't sure it wasn't. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She said that was possibly the most earnest thing anyone had ever said to her in a hotel cafe. Callum said he had been told he was too earnest before. She said she didn't mean it as a criticism, and the air between them shifted in a way that neither of them acknowledged out loud, the way weather changes before anyone thinks to check the forecast. They went over details for 12 more minutes. They agreed on ground rules, no excessive physical contact. They would keep things warm but not performative, and if either of them felt uncomfortable at any point, there was a code word. The word was Vermont, and they would find an excuse to step away. Callum agreed to all of it and shook her hand across the table, and Naomi looked at their joined hands with an expression that was half gratitude and half something more complicated. And then she stood up and said it was time to go meet her family. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was 30 seconds of charged silence. Naomi straightened her shirt. Callum rolled his sleeves down. They stood side by side, and Naomi said quietly, without looking at him, that she was sorry for dragging him into this. And Callum said equally quietly that nobody had dragged him anywhere. He said he had a very strong sense of self-preservation, and if he hadn't wanted to be here, he wouldn't be. Something about that simple statement, its matter-of-factness, its absence of martyrdom, settled something in Naomi's chest that had been unsettled since she had gotten into the car that morning. The door to room 412 opened, and the world Naomi had been describing became suddenly vividly real. Rosalind Voss was a small woman who filled rooms the way perfume does, subtly but completely. She had Naomi's green eyes and a silver bob, and the kind of smile that made you feel immediately that you had been evaluated and found acceptable. which was exactly what was happening as she opened the door and saw Callum standing in the hallway. Her eyes went to him, and then to Naomi's hand, and then back to him, and the smile widened by several degrees. And she said, "Oh, the way people say it when something exceeds their expectations." What followed was the most extraordinary hour of Callum Reed's adult life. Rosalind embraced him, and Patricia shook his hand and held it slightly too long, studying his face with transparent curiosity. Theo appeared from the balcony and did the thing brothers do, the measured assessment, the handshake that was also a test, the eyes that said, "I love my sister and you should know that means something." And Edie, grandmother Edie, who was small and white-haired and wearing a silk blouse the color of hydrangeas, looked at Callum from the corner of the room with those sharp, knowing eyes and said nothing at all for a long time. Callum was remarkable. That is the only word for it. He was not performative or theatrical. He didn't overplay the devoted husband with grand gestures or excessive endearments. He was simply present. He answered questions with just enough detail. He laughed at Theo's jokes and asked Rosalind about herself, genuinely asked, and listened genuinely. And when Aunt Patricia launched into a story about a cruise she had taken in 2019, he gave her his full attention and asked a follow-up question that made her look at him with such startled pleasure that Naomi had to look away. He touched the small of Naomi's back once, briefly, when they moved from the sitting area to the balcony. It was light, barely there, but it was the natural gesture of someone who knew someone's body well, and Naomi felt it move through her like a small electrical current. She told herself it was the performance. She told herself she was on edge, and everything felt amplified. She believed neither explanation. The hardest moment came from Edie. The old woman waited until the others had drifted into adjacent conversations. And then she came to stand beside Callum at the balcony railing, with the deliberate intention of someone who had been waiting all afternoon. She was small, but she looked up at him without any suggestion of smallness, and she said, without preamble, without softening, that he seemed like a good man. Callum said thank you. Edie said she had known a great many good men and a great many men who performed goodness, and that the difference was usually visible if you looked in the right place. Callum said that sounded like wisdom worth having. Edie said she was 80 years old and had earned every piece of it. And then she said, quietly in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, that whatever the real story was, she hoped her granddaughter had found someone worth the honesty. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Callum had experienced in months. He did not confirm or deny. He held the old woman's gaze with the steadiness that was simply part of his nature, and said that he hoped Naomi knew she deserved every good thing that was coming to her. And Edie looked at him for another long moment and then nodded once, slowly, as though something had been decided, and moved back into the room. Naomi had been standing just inside the door and had heard none of it, but had watched it. And when Callum came back inside, she looked at him with a question in her face. He just shook his head slightly, and she understood somehow. To let it go. Dinner that evening was in the hotel's main restaurant, a long table, candlelight, Edie's favorite wine, stories about a childhood Naomi wore on her face like weather. Callum sat beside Naomi and learned her in small pieces, how she pressed her lips together before she laughed, how she tilted her head left when she was thinking, how she unconsciously reached for water whenever the conversation got too close to something real. He noticed these things not because he was studying her, but because he was the kind of person who noticed. And at some point during the third course, he realized that noticing her had become, quietly and without announcement, the most interesting thing he had done in months. Theo cornered him after dessert, while the women gathered around Edie with birthday photographs. He didn't do it aggressively. He did it the way concerned brothers do it, with a casual hand on the shoulder and a steering motion toward the bar, and a very deliberately relaxed posture that was doing a lot of work. He ordered 2 bourbons and slid one to Callum and asked, simply and directly, whether Callum made his sister happy. Callum picked up the bourbon. He held it for a moment, And then he said something that surprised even himself. He said that he thought Naomi was one of the most capable people he had ever met, and that in his experience, people who were that capable sometimes forgot to let others take care of them. He said that he was working on that. He said it simply, without flourish, and Theo looked at him with the expression of someone who has just received an answer they didn't entirely expect but find they cannot argue with. They drank their bourbon. They talked about baseball for 6 minutes. When they returned to the group, something between them had settled. The night wound down slowly, the way good evenings with people you love do, reluctantly and with small backward glances. Rosalind hugged Callum at the door of the suite with genuine warmth. Edie patted his hand and held it for one long moment and said nothing. Theo said goodnight with the kind of nod that means you're all right. And then Callum and Naomi were walking down the 4th floor hallway together in the hotel's quiet hush. And Naomi said very softly that she didn't know what to say. Callum said she didn't have to say anything. She said that wasn't true, that what he had done was extraordinary, and she owed him at minimum the honesty of an acknowledgement. He said the acknowledgement was appreciated. They reached the door of her room and stopped. She looked up at him, and the hallway light was the soft amber that good hotels use to make everything feel slightly more cinematic, and she said she hadn't expected any of this. She said she hadn't expected him. He said that he hadn't expected this day either, but that it was, without question, the best day he'd had in a very long time. And she looked at him like she was searching for the joke, and when she found none, she looked away first. She thanked him. He said goodnight. He went to his own room, which was 2 floors up, and sat on the edge of the bed in his good clothes, and stared at the wall for a while. He was not, he told himself, developing feelings for a woman he had met 8 hours ago. He was emotionally engaged because the situation was emotionally engaging. He was a person who cared about people, and he had spent an entire day pretending to be someone's person, and of course, that left traces. This was entirely explainable and required no further examination. He examined it for 2 more hours before he fell asleep. The next morning was the birthday brunch, and Naomi knocked on his door at 9:15, looking like she hadn't slept well either. And when he opened the door in his interview clothes, because his interview was at 11 and Charleston's professional world apparently overlapped with the Grand Ashford's dining schedule, she stopped and looked at him in a way that she converted quickly into a question about what he was wearing. He told her about the interview. She had forgotten. Her face did something that might have been disappointment, or might have been concern, and she said she hoped it went well. And he said he hoped so too. She said she'd told her family he had a work call in the morning. He nodded. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then said she'd see him at noon, at brunch if he could make it in time. The interview was on King Street, at a furniture restoration company that was expanding and needed someone with Callum's particular combination of craft knowledge and small business experience. He had prepared for it. He walked in steady and walked out steadier. The owner, a man named Franklin Gear, who wore suspenders and smelled faintly of linseed oil and seemed constitutionally suspicious of resumes, but very interested in the actual grain of a person, shook his hand at the end and said he'd be in touch. The handshake held a second longer than perfunctory. Callum drove back to the Grand Ashford with the windows down. He arrived at brunch 7 minutes late and slid into the seat beside Naomi, and the relief that moved across her face when she saw him was so unguarded and immediate that she seemed to realize it a half-second after it happened, and redirected her eyes to her menu. Under the table, without quite planning to, she pressed her foot lightly against his. He did not move away. Neither did she. They ate eggs Benedict and listened to Edie tell a story about dancing in the 1970s, and Callum laughed in all the right places and several of the unexpected ones. And Rosalind watched him with the satisfied expression of a woman who has worried about her daughter for 3 years and is tasting, for the first time, the sweetness of relief after brunch. While the family gathered in the suite for cake and photographs, Callum and Naomi found 5 minutes alone on the balcony. The city stretched below them, the kind of gentle, history-soaked city that makes you feel like the world has been here longer than your problems. Naomi leaned on the railing and said without preamble that she wanted to tell her family the truth. Callum turned to look at her. She said she had been lying for 8 months, and every hour of this weekend had made it heavier, not lighter. She said that watching him with her family, watching the way he had been real with them, genuinely kind, asking real questions and giving real attention, had made her feel, for the first time, how hollow the performance had been. Not his performance, her lie. The absence of something real. He asked what she planned to say. She said she didn't entirely know. She said she would tell them she had made a mistake, that she had been scared, that she was sorry. She said she thought Edie already knew. Callum said he thought so too. She laughed slightly at that, the same short surprised laugh from the cafe yesterday, and then pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment, the way people do when they are very tired. He said he would stay if she wanted. He said it was her decision, but that he would stay and he would be there, not as Daniel, not as her husband, but as whatever he actually was. She asked what that was. He said he wasn't entirely sure, but that it was real, which was more than the alternative. She came clean at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, standing in her grandmother's hotel suite with Edie's birthday balloons still floating near the ceiling. She said it in a clear, even voice that only shook on 2 words, the word afraid and the word sorry. She told them about the 8 months, about Daniel, about Garrett and the volleyball injury and the drive from the city this morning, with the lie growing heavier in her chest. She told them she had panicked in the lobby, and she told them who Callum actually was, a stranger, a good man, someone she had trusted on instinct and who had deserved better than to be made complicit in her fear. The room held its breath. Rosalind cried. She cried not with anger, but with the helpless recognition that her love had sometimes felt like pressure, that her worry had occasionally been a weight her daughter couldn't put down, that the lie hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a place of love and fear, the 2 things that so often travel together. She crossed the room and held Naomi's face in her hands and said, "You never had to be anything other than what you are." Theo did not say the obvious thing. He stood up and went to Callum and said, with clear-eyed directness, that he still seemed like a decent man, regardless of the circumstances. Callum said he was trying to be. Theo said, "Keep trying," and sat back down. Aunt Patricia was quiet for a long moment and then said, with the air of someone determined to find the takeaway, that this was actually a much better story than a regular marriage. And Edie sat in her chair with her hands folded and her expression still, and looked at her granddaughter for a long time with those sharp, ocean-deep eyes. Then she looked at Callum. Then she said one thing. She said he came back for the brunch. She let that sit. She said, "A man who didn't care about you wouldn't have come back from an interview for a birthday brunch." She said nothing further, but the corner of her mouth moved. And the movement communicated with precision everything she had decided. The afternoon wound through it, the way rivers move through difficult terrain, finding the way through rather than going around. There were more tears, and then less, and then the particular tired sweetness that follows emotional honesty, the kind of lightness that only comes after something heavy has been set down. Rosalind ordered room service, and they all ate birthday cake with the slightly dazed camaraderie of people who have just survived something together and find they are still, fundamentally on the same side. Callum stayed. No one asked him to leave. No one suggested it would be more appropriate for him to go. He sat with Naomi's family, and they talked differently now, without the shadow of performance, without the architecture of the lie holding everything at a slight angle from real. He told them about Vermont. He told them about the woodworking studio and what had happened to it without self-pity, just as history. Rosalind asked about his family. He told them his mother was still in Vermont and called every Sunday and had very strong opinions about properly seasoned cast iron. They laughed. Edie asked about the interview. He said he thought it had gone well. She nodded, as though she had expected nothing less. At 7 o'clock, the family drifted toward the separate rhythms of a hotel evening. Rosalind to her bath, Patricia to a phone call, Vio to the hotel gym with the determined energy of a man processing his feelings through exercise. Edie, who was 80 and had earned the right to say exactly what she wanted when she wanted it, caught Callum's sleeve as he was rising and said, close and quiet, "Take care of my girl." He didn't point out that Naomi was not his girl. He just said yes. He and Naomi walked out of the suite together, and this time the hallway felt different, not the contained, charged silence of two people maintaining a performance, but the wide-open quiet of two people who no longer have anything to pretend. They went to the hotel bar, not because either of them needed a drink, but because neither of them was ready to go their separate directions, and this was the most natural available delay. They sat at a small corner table with the evening settling around them, and Naomi pulled the gold ring off her finger and set it on the table between them. They both looked at it. Callum said that for a prop it had done a lot of work. Naomi said she thought she owed it some kind of thanks. And then she laughed. Not the short, startled laugh from before, but a real one, open and unguarded. The laugh of someone who has been holding their breath for 8 months and has finally, extravagantly exhaled. He told her things. She told him things. Not the curated details they had exchanged in the cafe the morning before. Not the intelligence briefings of two people constructing a shared fiction, but real things, the kind that carry weight, the kind you don't usually unpack for strangers at hotel bars, but that emerge somehow when the usual rules of social architecture have already been thoroughly dismantled for the day. He told her how much losing the studio had cost him, not financially, but in the particular identity that comes with building something from nothing and watching it go. She told him about the 3 years in the city, the loneliness that she had gotten very good at making look like independence, the way she had invented Daniel not just to quiet her family, but to give herself the temporary comfort of believing someone loved her specifically and completely. He said that was one of the saddest things he had ever heard, and he said it without cruelty, just as a fact that deserved to be named. She said she knew. He said she deserved the real thing. She said she was starting to believe that might be true. They sat with that for a moment, the honesty of it settling between them like furniture in a room that finally has the right amount of light. He left at 10. She walked with him to the elevator, and they stood at those sliding doors the way they had stood at the door of her room the night before, but differently now. He said he was glad she had grabbed his arm in the lobby. She said she was too, which had not been entirely true at 8 in the morning, but was completely true now. He said he would call, and then he stopped and said he didn't have her number, which made her laugh again, and she put it in his phone. And the simple domestic act of it, the ordinary intimacy of a name saved in a contact list, felt like something beginning rather than something ending. He got in the elevator. The doors began to close. Naomi said his name. He stopped the door with his hand. She looked at him across the narrowing space and said that she still owed him an answer to his question from yesterday morning in the lobby. He waited. She said yes for the record. He said he'd remember that. The doors closed. Callum Reed rode the elevator to the 6th floor with the first full-body sense of purpose he'd had in years. Franklin Gear called the following Tuesday. He offered Callum the position. He said he had a good feeling about the handshake, which was, in Franklin's estimation, the most reliable metric available. Callum accepted. He drove back to Vermont to pack his life into boxes. And on the drive south again he called Naomi, and they talked for 3 hours without a single comfortable silence, because comfortable silences require a different kind of familiarity, the kind that comes later, the kind that takes time to build, the kind they were in their own unhurried way. Already building, Naomi told her family the truth, the whole truth, the real timeline. The lobby and the 23 minutes in the cafe and the ring purchased at a jewelry store 2 weeks ago. Rosalind cried again, but differently. Theo called Callum and said, in a voice that was working very hard to sound casual, that he was glad things had worked out. Edie sent a card. In her looping, old-fashioned cursive, she had written 4 words, "I knew you'd come back." Naomi put it on her refrigerator, where it stayed for a very long time. Callum found an apartment 10 minutes from Franklin's workshop. He built a small bookshelf in his first week in Charleston because a home without a bookshelf was not, in his considered opinion, a home. He took Naomi to dinner on a Thursday in October, a real dinner, with no cover story and no gold proppering and nothing to be anything except what they were, which was 2 people who had found each other sideways and were taking the long, deliberate road from there. She wore a different red top, a quieter one. And he noticed and didn't say anything, and she noticed that he noticed and didn't say anything either. And sometimes the most eloquent things are the things that stay in the air between 2 people, rather than landing anywhere. Love. Real love. The kind that is not about performance or perfect circumstances or the version of yourself you can maintain under scrutiny. Love is often built in exactly these kinds of impossible, backwards laugh-at-yourself moments. It is built in hotel lobbies and cafe corners and 4-minute elevator rides and birthday brunches you came back from an interview for. It is built in the decision to say a true thing when you could have said the comfortable one. It is built in letting someone be kind to you without immediately asking what it costs them. Naomi stopped lying, not just to her family but to herself. She stopped pretending that independence meant not needing anyone, stopped converting her loneliness into an aesthetic. She called her mother more. She let Edie's wisdom land instead of deflecting it. She sat with Callum on Sunday evenings in his apartment with its single bookshelf and the smell of sawdust that never quite left his hands. And she felt something she had invented a fictional husband to simulate but had never quite managed to manufacture, the specific warmth of being known. Callum built things. He had always built things. He built furniture that lasted and relationships that lasted, and slowly, carefully, with the same patience he brought to fine woodworking, he built something with Naomi that was made of real material, honesty and humor, and the particular tenderness of 2 people who have seen each other on their worst days and chosen to stay. On the evening of Edie's 81st birthday, which the family celebrated at a restaurant in the city, Callum sat across the table from the old woman who had seen through everything before the first dinner plate arrived. She looked at him with those sharp, satisfied eyes. She said, "You're still here." He said he was. She said, "Good." And she turned back to her menu with the air of someone who has been proven right and intends to enjoy every moment of it. Naomi reached under the table and took Callum's hand. He held it, no performance, no code word required. Just 2 people, present and honest, in a room full of the people who loved them. There was no gold ring. There was no pretend. There was only this, which was, it turned out, the most extraordinary thing. If this story moved you, if you felt something in Naomi's courage, in Callum's quiet kindness, in Edie's knowing eyes, please let this video know. Like it, share it with someone who needs a reminder that love finds its way in even the most unexpected moments. Leave a comment and tell us which part of this story hit you the hardest. Your engagement means everything and helps FableBox reach more hearts around this world. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. Thank you for being here. Before this story ends, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if a stranger asked you to pretend to be their spouse? Would you have said yes? We genuinely want to know. Some love stories begin with a ring. Some begin with a lie that was really just a person too afraid to ask for the real thing. The most extraordinary ones begin with someone grabbing a stranger's arm in a hotel lobby and a question that had no right to work, and a man who somehow, impossibly, had exactly the right answer.